Last year we developed about 1,000 recipes here in the test kitchen. My favorite was apple galette. David Pasmino is going to show us how to prepare this French tart with a super flaky crust and sweet caramelized apples. For this recipe and other information in the podcast, go to cooksillustrated.com/podcast.
Although galettes come in different shapes and sizes, we felt the ideal apple galette should have both a thin, crispy crust and apples that are deep golden brown. Start by combining the dry ingredients in a food processor, followed by large cubes of cold butter, pulsed into their size of large pebbles, about a ½ inch. Pulse 7 to 9 tablespoons of ice water into the dough, 1 tablespoon at a time, until a small amount of the dough comes together when pinched in the hands. Form the dough into a 5 by 12 inch rectangle, and using the heel of your hand, smear a small amount of dough across your work surface. This is called frissage, a technique borrowed from French pastry that ensures a crispy, flaky dough. Press the dough into a 4 by 4 inch square, wrap in plastic, and chill for 30 to 60 minutes. About 15 minutes before the dough is ready, peel, core, halve, and slice the apples into 1/8 inch thick slices. This ensures that they will cook and brown evenly. Roll out the dough onto a floured 16 by 12 inch piece of parchment until the dough overhangs all 4 sides. Trim excess dough so the edges are even with the parchment. Roll up edges to form a 1/2 inch thick border. Transfer both dough and parchment to a rim baking sheet. Starting in any corner, shingle the apples in even rows, overlapping each slice by about half. The apples shrink while cooking, and this prevents the dough from being exposed and burning. Dot the apples with 1/4 inch cubes of butter and sprinkle evenly with a 1/4 cup of sugar. Bake for 45 to 60 minutes until the bottom of the tart is deep golden brown and the apples have caramelized. Brush with apricot glaze and cool in a wire rack for 15 minutes before serving. Once you've peeled the apples, remove the core using an apple corer, and using a knife, cut the apple in half. Place the apple half cut side down on the cutting board and slice from end to end into 1/8 inch thick slices. The slices should be the thickness of 2 dimes, just like this. This slice is a 1/4 inch thick. Although it looks thin, it's thick enough that the apples won't cook all the way through, and the excess moisture will make the crust less crisp. You'll also run out of apples before you finish the tart. Rather than evenly cutting the butter into the dry ingredients with a food processor, we only let the food processor do part of the work. Once the butter is cut into curd-like pieces along with the flour and the water, we go ahead and dump the mixture onto the work surface, forming a 12 by 5 inch rectangle with a bench scraper. Using the heel of your hand in a technique called frissaging, push small pieces of the dough, smearing it against the countertop to form another pile of dough 4 to 6 inches away from the original one. What this does is create long, thin strips of butter in the dough. Ultimately, this will create the flaky dough that we're looking for. Once you've gone through the dough once, regather the dough into another rectangle and go ahead and smear against the work surface a second time. This won't take nearly as long as the first time. Once you've gone through the dough, simply take your bench scraper and form a 4 inch square. Smooth the edges, wrap it in plastic wrap, and put it in the refrigerator for 30 to 60 minutes to allow the now softened butter to harden up a little bit. In this recipe, you want to roll the dough out into a large rectangle on a piece of parchment paper cut to 16 by 12 inches. The dough will stick to the parchment, so flour the paper and the top of the dough. If the dough gets too soft, it will start sticking to the paper and the rolling pin. If this happens, you can slide the parchment paper with the dough onto a baking sheet and place it into the refrigerator until the dough hardens. This dough has better consistency. It's easy to roll out. It might stick a bit, but I can lift up the dough, dust with a little flour, and keep going. Once the dough is 16 by 12 inches, the same size as the piece of parchment paper, trim any overhanging edges even with the parchment. Roll up the edges to create a border and transfer the parchment and dough to a baking sheet. This dough is now ready to shingle with apples.
To get the recipe and other information featured in this podcast, go to cooksillustrated.com/podcast.